Welcome to Atlas Explained, where every border carries a hidden story. The water between India and the island to its south is narrow enough that fishermen have crossed it for centuries without thinking of borders. On clear days, the coast feels close familiar, almost domestic, as if the land were simply another extension of the mainland. India grew into a republic that does not hesitate to argue over territory, to defend borders drawn and redrawn by war, partition, and law. Yet this island remained untouched by those arguments present in geography, but absent from claim. There is something uneasy about that absence. Sri Lanka shares languages, gods, migrations, and bloodlines with the Indian mainland ties that run older than most modern states. Tamils live on both sides of the water, their rituals unchanged by the sea that separates them. The island appears in Indian epics, in trade routes and memory, yet it never became an Indian state, never even lingered as a serious ambition after independence. This is not because India lacked opportunity. The subcontinent has absorbed kingdoms, dissolved borders, and inherited empires through the long grinding processes of colonial collapse and national consolidation. When the British withdrew, India inherited not only land, but the confidence that it could hold it together. In that moment, when maps were being rewritten with hurried pens and exhausted compromises, the island remained quietly outside the frame. The silence around Sri Lanka is telling. It suggests not a forgotten prize, but a space already settled by earlier decisions, decisions made far from the water that separates the two lands. Long before independence, long before nationalism hardened into doctrine, the island's fate had already been filed away under a different category. Not disputed, not absorbed, simply elsewhere. That separation did not begin with India's leaders or Sri Lanka's people. It began with outsiders who arrived by sea and treated the island not as an extension of a continent, but as an object that could be handled on its own terms. To them, proximity meant convenience, not kinship, and administration mattered more than continuity. Once that logic took hold, it became easier to maintain than to undo. So the story does not start with a refusal or a debate, but with a quiet structural decision that no one at the time believed would matter. An island governed separately, recorded separately, thought of separately. By the time the empire loosened its grip, the distance across the water had already become something else entirely. Not a crossing, but a boundary that felt natural because it had been there for so long. Long before it was called Ceylon, the island was already fragmented not in chaos but in balance. Coastal kingdoms traded outward, inland rulers guarded elevation and distance, and the sea functioned less as a barrier than as a corridor. When the Portuguese arrived, they did not conquer the island all at once. They negotiated, pressured, waited, and accepted partial access, believing control of ports was control enough. The Dutch followed with the same assumption. They inherited forts contracts and expectations rather than sovereignty. On paper, their influence hugged the coastline, while the interior remained governed by the Sinhalese kingdom of Kandy, a state that understood terrain as leverage. Europeans mistook this arrangement for stability. They believed influence could be modular, that commerce and faith could be expanded without fully disturbing the political core. Local rulers believed something else. Concessions were seen as temporary foreign presence, as manageable, and European rivalries as distractions that could be exploited. Each side believed it was containing the other. Neither understood how easily partial control could harden into entitlement once backed by distant power. This arrangement created a hollow center. The coast was exposed to Europe's ambitions while the interior remained independent but increasingly isolated. The island functioned as two political worlds forced into proximity without integration. It worked until it didn't, until European conflicts spilled beyond treaties and into strategy. By the time the Dutch presence weakened, the island was already marked as a prize that could be taken whole rather than negotiated piece by piece. The balance that had preserved local autonomy now appeared to outsiders as inefficiency. What had once been an advantage fragmentation became justification for intervention. And intervention came not because of Sri Lanka itself, but because of a continent away. When Europe convulsed in revolution and war, the island's partial arrangements suddenly looked like vulnerabilities. The sea that had brought traders and missionaries now carried fleets with clear intentions. Control would no longer stop at the shoreline. The island was never one thing. It carried two histories at once, layered over the same ground without ever fully merging. In the south and interior lived the Sinhalese majority bound to Buddhism monarchy and land shaped by irrigation and ritual. In the north and along the eastern edges lived Tamils Hindu, by tradition oriented culturally and commercially toward southern India. The water between them and the mainland was narrow enough to cross wide enough to matter. This division was not inherently violent. It was lived habitual and negotiated over generations. Difference existed without demanding resolution, but it also invited misreading. To outsiders, plurality looked like manageability. If the island contained multiple identities, then no single one could resist external authority for long. Diversity was mistaken for weakness. The British would later inherit this assumption, but it predated them. European observers believed that governing difference was simpler than confronting unity. Religious tolerance could be declared, divisions could be balanced, and order could be imposed without choosing sides. What they missed was how identity hardens when pressure comes from above rather than across. Geography reinforced the illusion. The mountainous interior felt distant from the northern plains. Roads were slow, communication uneven. To administrators looking at maps, the island appeared naturally divisible, a place where separate communities could be managed independently under a single foreign hand. But separation without integration does not stay neutral. It becomes a quiet form of classification. Once written into reports, census tables, and military planning, identity stops being descriptive and starts becoming administrative. People are no longer simply where they live or what they practice. They become categories to be governed. As European attention shifted from trade to control, these categories would be leaned on harder. What had once been background context became a governing logic, and when events elsewhere forced Britain to act decisively, the island's internal divisions would no longer be treated as social facts but as tools. In the 1790s, Europe was no longer managing colonies carefully. It was reacting. Revolutions overturned old alliances, and the Dutch Republic found itself pulled into the orbit of revolutionary France, an alignment that mattered less in Sri Lanka than it did in London. To Britain, Dutch control of the island was no longer a commercial arrangement. It was a strategic risk. The decision to act did not come from Colombo or Kandy. It came from a continent away from war rooms where maps were marked quickly and explanations were unnecessary. If France controlled the Dutch and the Dutch controlled Ceylon's ports, then Britain needed those ports more than it needed to understand the island itself. Strategy replaced curiosity. British forces moved in 1796 with little ceremony. The Dutch were driven out and British Ceylon came into existence almost by accident, formed not through a grand colonial vision, but through a series of urgent wartime decisions. Timing mattered more than planning, and the timing was everything. At that moment, much of India was already under British influence, but not under British government. Power on the subcontinent flowed through the British East India Company, a commercial entity that ruled vast populations without being a state in the conventional sense. Ceylon did not follow that pattern. It was placed directly under the crown, administered by a governor appointed from London. No one paused to consider what that difference would mean later. To administrators, it was an efficiency. To the empire, it was a footnote. But governance is memory. Once an island is ruled differently, it begins to be thought of differently. Paper trails diverge. Chains of command harden. By the time the war in Europe subsided, the separation was already routine. India was managed through profit and proxies. Ceylon was governed as a possession. The island's fate had been decided not by its people or its proximity, but by the speed with which Britain had needed to act. In India, authority wore many masks. The British East India Company ruled vast territories, but it rarely ruled directly. Local elites remained in place. Taxes were collected by familiar hands, and governance blurred into commerce. The company cared about stability only insofar as it protected revenue. Legitimacy was improvised, not imposed. Ceylon was different. From the beginning, it was treated as something to be administered, not leveraged. British officials arrived with legal codes, expectations, and a sense that the island should function like a model colony. Decisions flowed downward from London, not sideways through negotiation. There were fewer intermediaries and less patience for adaptation. This difference shaped habit before it shaped policy. In India, British authority felt distant, filtered through Indian rulers and company officials whose loyalty was transactional. In Ceylon, authority was visible, foreign, and unapologetic. The island was not being prepared for partnership. It was being organized. At first, this seemed orderly. Roads were surveyed, courts established trade, regulated, but order came at the cost of distance. Governance was no longer something negotiated within society. It was something applied to it. The British did not need to learn the island's internal logic. They only needed it to function. That distinction mattered more than anyone admitted. Over time, it taught administrators to think of Ceylon as separate from the subcontinent, not merely geographically, but administratively and culturally. The island was not part of the Indian system. It was its own unit, cleanly defined and easily isolated. And while this arrangement appeared efficient on paper, it left little room for shared identity to develop across the water. India and Ceylon were ruled by the same empire, but they were not being shaped into the same future. That divergence would soon be tested violently in the island's interior. The interior of the island did not yield easily. The Kingdom of Kandy had survived European pressure precisely because it refused to be accessible. Its power lay in elevation, forest, and distance, and it understood that visibility invited control. When the British pushed inland, they entered a world that did not respond to proclamations or treaties written at sea level. The first war against Kandy ended in humiliation. British forces were drawn into unfamiliar terrain, cut off and slaughtered in an ambush that left the empire briefly stunned. It was a reminder that administration on paper meant nothing without compliance on the ground. Kandy remained independent, and for a moment it seemed that the island's interior might resist the same logic that had claimed its coast. That resistance did not last. The second conflict unfolded less as a conquest than as a collapse from within. The Kandyan king Sri Vikrama Rajasinha was isolated, unpopular, and increasingly dependent on coercion. He was also a Tamil ruling over a largely Sinhalese aristocracy, a detail that mattered quietly but decisively. British officials noticed. Kandyan nobles noticed too. Alliances formed in whispers. Local elites calculated that British rule might be preferable to a king they no longer trusted. When the British returned, they did not face a unified kingdom. They faced a divided court. The king was deposed not only by foreign force, but by his own nobles who delivered him into exile, believing they had secured their autonomy. They were wrong. The third conflict came swiftly. The British turned on the very chiefs who had helped them, crushing rebellions born of betrayal and regret. The island was unified under British control, but the memory of how that unity was achieved lingered. Power had been traded, not transferred. By 1817, Ceylon belonged entirely to Britain, but it belonged without consent and without intermediaries who could claim ownership of the outcome. The alliances that had enabled conquest had also ensured that no shared legitimacy survived it. Once the island was secured, Britain ruled with an efficiency that left little room for negotiation. Law was standardized courts, reshaped authority clarified. Unlike India, where custom survived as a tool of stability, Ceylon was treated as something to be corrected rather than accommodated. Religious tolerance existed, but only provisionally. Anglican influence expanded quietly through schools' patronage and social advancement. Conversion was rarely forced, but belief was reorganized. Faith became another system to be administered, not a boundary to be respected. This style of rule widened the island's distance from India. Authority in Ceylon answered directly to British officials whose careers were made elsewhere. Decisions looked outward toward London, not inward toward local balance or precedent. The East India Company appeared only where profit demanded it. Cinnamon was extracted, accounts settled, and the company withdrew again. It did not govern, and it did not pretend to. Its limited role reinforced a growing assumption that Ceylon did not belong to the Indian system at all. By habit, rather than decree, the island became something separate. Order was achieved, but at the cost of shared political imagination. And while this arrangement looked stable, it depended on an assumption that obedience once secured would endure. The East India Company had never intended to rule societies. It ruled because profit required control and because no one else had taken responsibility for what it acquired. In India, this contradiction was tolerated for decades, hidden behind ledgers and military payrolls. In Ceylon, the contradiction was contained. The company extracted where it could, stepped back where it could not, and left governance to the crown. Rule and revenue remained unusually separate. On the mainland, separation was impossible. The company hired armies, raised taxes, and issued commands while insisting it was merely doing business. Stability was treated as a cost, not a duty. Authority existed, but legitimacy did not. Indian soldiers were recruited for efficiency rather than belonging. Sepoys enforced an order they did not shape under officers who measured loyalty in output rather than trust. The distance between command and consequence grew quietly, dangerously. By the middle of the 19th century, that distance could no longer be managed. The company's system had stretched too far across too many lives. What followed would expose its limits brutally and force the empire to confront what it had long avoided. The rupture did not announce itself as rebellion. It moved first as rumor carried in barracks and marketplaces, repeated softly enough to test whether it was safe to say aloud. Sepoys had served the company for years without belonging to it. They marched drilled and enforced order for an authority that treated obedience as a resource, not a relationship. Grievances accumulated quietly. Pay lagged behind expectation. Promotion stalled. Customs were ignored, then dismissed. The company did not see this as cruelty. It saw it as efficiency. Soldiers were interchangeable units in a system designed to function without intimacy or trust. The cartridges arrived wrapped in practicality. Rifles required grease. The grease was said to come from pork lard and beef tallow. To company officers, it was a technical detail. To Muslim and Hindu sepoys, it was something else entirely. Not just an insult to belief, but confirmation of indifference. Proof that the authority commanding them neither understood nor cared who they were. Refusals spread faster than orders could contain it. What began as hesitation hardened into defiance. Mutiny did not move as a single wave. It flared unevenly, shaped by local resentment and sudden opportunity. Some units rebelled. Others hesitated. Many watched, waiting to see whether authority would fracture or hold. When violence erupted, it did not follow a script. Old loyalties resurfaced. Local rulers hesitated. Civilians were pulled into a conflict they had not chosen. The company responded with force, but force exposed rather than concealed its weakness. An institution built for profit found itself responsible for rule and discovered it had no language for legitimacy. The uprising shocked Britain less for its scale than for what it revealed. Control exercised without care had limits. Armies raised for convenience could turn. Order enforced without respect could dissolve overnight. The company had not merely failed to govern India, it had proven itself incapable of understanding it. The response was swift and final. The Crown stepped in, stripped the company of authority, and reorganized rule openly. India would no longer be managed indirectly. It would be ruled formally and visibly as empire rather than enterprise. Ceylon observed this collapse from the margins. It did not burn. It did not revolt. It remained quiet, already governed in the manner Britain now believed necessary everywhere else. When India was remade through crisis, the island was left untouched, its separation confirmed by the very violence it avoided. The year 1858 rearranged an empire without revisiting its margins. In India, the transfer of power from company to crown was framed as correction, a necessary tightening of control after embarrassment and bloodshed. New titles were issued, new hierarchies formalized, and the language of governance became explicit. India was no longer managed indirectly, it was possessed openly, but this moment of consolidation did not unify everything Britain held nearby. Ceylon remained administratively untouched by the transformation. It did not enter the British Raj. It was not folded into the new imperial narrative being written across the subcontinent. The island stayed where it already was governed, separately reported, separately imagined, separately. This was not a debate. No serious proposal circulated to merge Ceylon into the Raj. Its difference was already normalized, its exclusion already procedural. While India was reorganized to prevent another mutiny, Ceylon was considered stable, obedient, and uncomplicated. Stability once achieved rarely invites restructuring. The Raj expanded outward across the mainland, absorbing modern Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar into a single imperial logic. It tolerated princely states, managed diversity, and learned to speak the language of permanence. Ceylon did not participate in that learning. It was governed as a possession rather than a problem. This distinction mattered quietly. The Raj became a framework for imagining India as a single political space, however fractured. Ceylon never entered that imagination. It was not one of the pieces that needed to be held together. It was already held separately. By the time the empire settled into its new shape, the opportunity for integration had passed without ceremony. The island's separation was no longer a decision. It was a habit reinforced by years of paperwork precedent and administrative convenience. Empire learned to think in compartments. Not every territory needed to belong to the same story, even if it belonged to the same crown. Near India, Britain maintained other possessions that were governed separately, islands of authority that answered to London without passing through Delhi or Calcutta. Ceylon was not unique. It was simply consistent. Within India itself, the Raj accepted fragmentation as long as it was controlled. Princely states retained their rulers' ceremonies and internal hierarchies so long as they did not interfere with imperial priorities. Unity was never the goal. Predictability was. The empire did not erase difference. It arranged it. Queen Victoria's new title, Empress of India, symbolized that arrangement. It bound the subcontinent together rhetorically while allowing its edges to remain flexible. Ceylon lay just beyond that rhetorical boundary. It was close enough to be useful, distant enough to ignore. Over time, this separation shaped expectation. Administrators learned to think of India as something that required constant negotiation, a space dense with politics and consequence. Ceylon was thought of as quieter, more manageable, a place where authority did not need to bargain as hard. The island's compliance became part of its identity. That identity persisted even as the empire aged. When British power began to wane, the frameworks it had built did not dissolve with it. Territories prepared for independence using the categories they had been given. India imagined itself whole because it had been governed that way. Ceylon imagined itself alone because it always had been. The empire did not intend to create future nations so distinctly. But intention mattered less than repetition. By the time independence approached, separation was no longer something to be argued over. It was something everyone had learned to accept. When independence finally arrived, it did not feel like a moment of choice. It felt like the release of a tension that had been held in place for generations. India emerged as a state accustomed to thinking in continental scale, its borders defined by inheritance and loss. Sri Lanka emerged as a country already practiced in standing alone. There was no serious reckoning over union, no prolonged argument over absorption or claim. The island had never been part of the Indian administrative world, and so it did not appear in India's political imagination as something unfinished. Separation had been rehearsed too thoroughly to feel unnatural. The borders that mattered were not drawn at independence. They had been drawn earlier through patterns of rule habit and neglect. When Britain departed, it left behind more than flags and constitutions. It left behind a way of thinking about where authority belonged. Sri Lanka's independence was not a rejection of India. It was the continuation of a structure built long before either state existed. What looked like a choice was in reality an inheritance. The island stepped into sovereignty already defined as distinct. Across the narrow water, the mainland watched without urgency. The distance felt familiar, even inevitable. Fishermen still crossed languages, still overlapped gods, still traveled. But the political bond had never been allowed to form. The empire was gone, but its quiet decisions remained. An island governed separately became an island imagined separately. And once that imagination took hold, it no longer required force to sustain it.